Indonesians live, die, live again, and thrive by the indifferent powers of water, fire, and earth. Indonesia has the fourth largest population on the planet, spanning a massive archipelago with abundant resources. However, it is oftentimes overlooked in the realm of geopolitics. It is one of the top 20 largest economies on the planet, yet most people just think about it in terms of a habitat for orangutans, Komodo dragons, and drunk Australian tourists. So we will delve into this truly underrated power and see how its trajectory is going to look like over the course of the next century, or more accurately, the rest of this century. The most noticeable aspect of Indonesia's geography is obviously the fact that it's a giant archipelago of islands, sprawled along the equator, making it very warm and humid, perfect for rainforests. This geography gives Indonesia astonishing resources, biodiversity, and beauty, but at the same time is at the cost of being an infrastructure nightmare, having to build across several islands over vast waterways, mountains, and jungles. It's not a surprise that a chain of islands would be, well, volcanic. After all, these are volcanic islands, which makes them very rich in nutrients in many parts of the country, but also a massive curse, as Indonesia pretty much has the worst seismic activity in terms of earthquakes and volcanoes, bar none. A very large portion of the most dangerous volcanoes in the world are in Indonesia, and many of them are close to population centers. And this isn't even counting earthquakes and tsunamis. More than any other country, Indonesians live, die, and live again due to the elements. The most important island is Java, home to 150 million plus and getting bigger, with a population larger than that of Russia's. This includes the capital and largest city, Jakarta, home to over 10 million people, making it a megacity. Jakarta is on the northwest of the island of Java and acts as a major political, economic, and cultural center. Jakarta's got a lot to offer, but it also has many problems, namely massive congestion, bad urban planning, bad infrastructure, and oh yeah, I forgot to mention the city is literally sinking. The second most populous island is Sumatra, which is also a major economic center given its large population, and is located on the western half of the nation where most people reside. Other well-known islands include the third most populous, Sulawesi, along with Borneo, the largest and most biodiverse with orangutans, as well as a border with Malaysia. There is also the famous Komodo Island, home to the Komodo dragon, and there's the island of Bali, home to the primary center of Hindu culture, and is a world-renowned tourist destination, especially for Australian tourists that like to frolic around its streets. In the far east lies Papua, bordering the nation of Papua New Guinea. They split the island in half, and this is a fairly small population, oftentimes known for being more impoverished and less developed, but is renowned for its diversity in anthropology and biology. As you can imagine, this set of islands makes infrastructure a nightmare. Not only having to build roads and trains, but also seaports, airports, harbors, along with all of the administrative and repair costs that oftentimes are astronomical. However, there are some advantages. Running all these islands means that Indonesia has control of so many critical waterways, and given that so much international trade goes up on the open oceans, this means that Indonesia controls many of these important choke points, particularly those between the US and China. Now let's take a brief history detour. The first inhabitants of these islands were some of the first humans to travel outside of Africa, going through the Middle East and the Indian subcontinent, and then using rafts to travel around these islands and eventually to Australia. In many ways, the first inhabitants were quite similar to the people you'd see among the Australian Aboriginals. Later waves of human migrations, predominantly from the mainland of Asia, would eventually overtake these native islanders, subjugating the native inhabitants. And most of the native inhabitants usually are situated on the island of Papua to the east. Eventually, these newcomers would adopt the religions of Hinduism and later Buddhism, given their close proximity to the Indian subcontinent. While people from the Indian subcontinent would bring religion, people from China would bring their economics, and to this day, the Chinese have played a massive role in Southeast Asia's economic might. Complex civilizations emerge in what is now Indonesia, far later than they did in India or China. Eventually, power would consolidate around these waterways. Myths, legends, and tales of these empires, along with some historical facts, would be used as a unifying theory for Indonesian nationalists who wanted a cohesive identity during the 20th century to unite this very diverse country. Eventually, before that would happen, trade relations between these islands and the Middle East would bring Islam into the fold, making Indonesia the largest Muslim-majority country on Earth. Despite the growth of Islam, Bali remained a center of Hinduism, and Buddhism and Christianity also have played a pivotal role in Indonesia's culture. The first major Europeans to arrive were the Portuguese, the first worldwide empire, if you could call it that, and they spread Christianity and Western institutions, as well as a lot of gunpowder. However, the Portuguese were quite fond of desperately trying to convert many of the native peoples to Catholicism, which didn't go on well in a predominantly Muslim area. Eventually, the Dutch would come along, and at the beginning they preferred to the Portuguese because they were more tolerant of different religions. However, the Dutch would eventually set up the Dutch East India Company, the first truly multinational corporation, which led to a great deal of exploitation of the islands to gain access to the spice trade, which resulted in a lot of profits. Given the exploitation by the Dutch, many native Indonesians would eventually find solace in nationalistic ideologies. Funny enough, these nationalistic ideologies by and large came from the West, but were now being used by colonized people as a form of liberation from the people who just want to exploit them for their spices. One unusual quirk is that these spices were cloves, nutmeg, mace, and cinnamon, all spices that Westerners tend to associate with cold weather in the Christmas time, yet they're actually from the tropics. Nutmeg would never grow particularly well in a very cold climate, let alone winter in North America or Europe. Anyway, many Indonesians eventually sought out nationalism, and some even sided with the Japanese when they invaded. However, this proved to be a pretty bad idea. Japanese war crimes were pretty terrible during World War II. Nonetheless, Indonesia eventually got independence. During the early stages of the Cold War, Indonesia joined the Non-Aligned Movement, a group of developing countries that threw the yoke of European colonialism but wanted to stay neutral when it came to the fight between the Soviet Union and the United States. However, at this stage, Indonesia preferred the USSR, but only by a little bit. Eventually, there was a coup, and Indonesia tended to prefer the Western powers. Eventually, the country would democratize after a period of some pretty terrible internal squabbling, and let's just say things I can't say unless I want to get demonetized. The country would eventually democratize during the 2000s. Today, Indonesia is part of the G20, part of the 20 largest economies in the world. Historically, and even to this day, Indonesia's economy is highly based off of agriculture, being a major producer of rice and fish, as well as most famously spices, but also rubber, coming from the rubber trees that inhabit the region, initially taken from the Amazon rainforest. This was a strategic part of the reason why the Japanese invaded during World War II, as rubber is necessary for tires and military equipment. Or at least it was before synthetic rubber. Another major sector is palm oil, which produces a lot of revenue but at the same time creates a tremendous amount of ecological destruction, as vast swaths of the rainforest are replaced by monocultures of palm trees. The country also has some other raw materials, namely hydrocarbons like oil, gas, and coal, but also some mineral wealth, namely copper. Many of these resources are located in the sparsely populated eastern portions of the country. The country also has manufacturing, particularly automobiles, textiles, and electronics. For this reason, it's classified as a newly industrialized nation. However, whether it contributes to a post-industrial economy is another matter. As far as the service sector is concerned, it is also a major hub of tourism, namely on the island of Bali, but also the islands of Borneo and Komodo to a lesser extent. Unfortunately, Indonesia's wealth and skill set in terms of its labor force are lower than that of many other countries in the region, like Malaysia and even more so Singapore. And many rural parts of the country are still very poor. In spite of relatively poor infrastructure, a great deal of the poverty and corruption, and a lot of ineptitude on various sectors of government, the country still has a fairly positive outlook, particularly given its demographics and resources. This large population of young people is bound to be very productive in the coming decades. Granted, much of this prosperity comes from the Chinese diaspora. A massive swath of the economy is run by this population. These are not Chinese people from China, but rather Chinese Indonesians. They are truly part of the country. However, various Malay ethnic groups control the politics, and while the Chinese control the economy, this has led to some tension between various ethnic groups. While the country is majority Muslim, Indonesia is also fairly moderate, in sharp contrast to many other countries like, say, Iran or Saudi Arabia. There are exceptions to this. Many provinces in the western island of Sumatra tend to incorporate Sharia law. However, this tends to be the exception rather than the norm. It is worth keeping in mind that while Indonesia is a Muslim-majority country, it is not an Islamist country, at least not on the official level. Indonesia, at the end of the day, is a secular country. Generally speaking, there is a degree of strong pluralism in Indonesia and a greater degree of diversity of thought. Indonesia, after all, has an identity that is a product of shared geography, history, and culture, independence from the Dutch and other cultural factors, rather than one based off of an Islamic theocracy. Despite having an exceptionally brutal history when it comes to political crackdowns in the past, the country today is fairly democratic, with some hiccups here and there when it comes to civil liberties, and in particular its draconian drug policies. One particularly unusual aspect of Indonesia is that despite being so large and so diverse, it has a unitary government, not a federal one, meaning that the central government holds way too much power for such a diverse, large country, in sharp contrast to other large landmass countries like Canada, the US, Brazil, Australia, etc. This means that there just isn't that much autonomy for certain regions, and they all have to abide by what Jakarta says. Now let's move on to foreign affairs. The country has had fairly good relations with the United States, but not close enough to be allies of any sort. It also has fairly cordial relations with Western neighbors like Australia. Australia and Indonesia are massive trading partners. Australia is also a center of much of Indonesia's diaspora. However, the two have some issues, namely over Australian wiretapping and spying, as well as Indonesia's human rights record, particularly when it comes to East Timor. In the same way that India has a love-hate relationship with the UK, Indonesia kind of has a love-hate relationship with the Netherlands. As far as Southeast Asia is concerned, the country is the main hegemon, the big head honcho, pretty much the main regional power. However, this has led to some disgruntlement among certain countries in the region. One major issue Indonesia faces is its relatively weak navy, given the fact that both Australia and China can exert their power in the region quite easily. Indonesia may be one of the few countries on the planet that probably should invest more in their navy than their army, given the geographic and maritime circumstances. The country is also a member of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and it's probably a wise deal to make sure that you have some sort of camaraderie with your neighbors rather than antagonizing them, which some other countries have done. After decolonization, there was even some talk of a Southeast Asian Union along with the Philippines and Malaysia, but this never came to fruition. One major issue is Indonesia's strained relationship with Malaysia, a former British colony. Part of this is because Indonesia was opposed to the creation of Malaysia in the first place, as well as the mistreatment of Indonesian migrant workers in Malaysia, along with some territorial disputes that still go on to this day. Moving further northward, we get to the big elephant in the room. You guessed it, China. Indonesia has a fairly friendly approach to China, however, not too friendly to annoy Western powers. And there is some degree of anti-Chinese sentiment that exists among much of the Malay population. Overall, China is Indonesia's most important trading partner, so they get along pretty well. Nonetheless, Indonesia has been concerned about the building of artificial islands in the South China Sea, but given that Indonesia is too far to the south of that region, it's not so much bothered by it to the same extent that, say, the Philippines, Vietnam, or Malaysia are. Since Indonesia doesn't share as many maritime borders with China, this leads to less antagonism towards the Chinese state, even though antagonism towards the Chinese population within Indonesia is unfortunately quite common. And this is in spite of a fairly positive trajectory. It is unlikely, at the end of the day, that Indonesia will exert military power outside of this region, or political power for that matter. However, it will most likely be able to exert a fair degree of economic power. Indonesia has a lot going for it: its demographics, its regions, its resources, but at the same time, it's mired with corruption and pretty shitty infrastructure. It's not enough to simply have a large population, a large landmass, and a large number of resources. You need education, innovation, and a culture of I can do it. And you have to be able to move past those barriers. And whether or not Indonesia can do this is really still up for debate. Indonesia may want to reassess its unitary government, as well as fund its navy to make sure that Indonesians control Indonesian waterways, water resources, and the straits, not the US, not China, or any other country for that matter. Indonesia should have the final say. Indonesia will also have to invest in the eastern portion of this country that are underdeveloped, and make sure that those people feel like they're part of a greater nation state and contribute to the economy. Indonesia also needs to deal with a lot of its border disputes, particularly with Malaysia, if it wants to secure national security and sovereignty. I know I'm being redundant here, but it's just true. More than any other country, Indonesia is the wild card. After all, much of the Pacific is tied between two great powers, with Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, Australia, and New Zealand being on the US side, while China has North Korea and Cambodia as well as Burma on the other side. Indonesia could be the balancing factor. It could end up on one side or the other. If anything, whatever position they take will have massive ramifications in the future. And that's why we should all be paying way more attention to the land of fire, water, and earth.